So today we are going to learn how to make this simple piece of ice in Substance Designer and then bring it into Unreal Engine and have it rendered out here. And we will give it some functionality, so we'll be able to adjust its opacity, and we'll also be able to adjust the surface roughness. And we'll begin in Substance Designer, and we'll build the material in there, and then we'll come into Unreal and we'll take a look at how to hook it up in here once we've built the entire material. Before we actually start building our material, I wanted to take a quick overview of the material here in the test that I made. And it's actually a lot simpler than this graph would imply, because there's only three basic elements to it. So we have the crackles, the grit, and then the scratches. But I've given myself this extra layer of tweakability, if you will, where I've actually really separated out all these bits so I can do a lot of levels changing here, but I'm only putting variables on these last nodes here. So the input variables that'll be accessible in the engine are just two very simple sliders that are going to control all these nodes. But by using constants here, I'm actually simplifying my material. Also, the material that you saw, I had built my own effects map for those scratches, and we're actually going to trade that out for this scratches generator. And you can do either or. You can create whatever kind of noises you want. So while I'm trying to keep things simple and use what we have in the Substance library, any of these effects in here, you can replace for a custom effect that you make yourself. That being said, let's start our material. So I'm going to come in here, new substance. We'll call this ice. And you can use PBR. We're going to actually adjust it a little bit. We're not going to have any metallic, but we do want a specular. I could delete this and make a new node, or I can just go ahead and get into this node's properties and just change it. So I'm going to call this spec level. And down here, we'll change it to specular level. And this will allow us to change the specularity, which is a material's reflectiveness, as opposed to roughness, which is just how smooth or rough something is. So this is its like mirror-like qualities. So as this goes from black, which is no mirror-like qualities whatsoever, to white, which is full mirror-like qualities. Okay. So let's start with our scratches. I'm going to come into my library, and in here there's a scratches generator, which is a very useful node if you want to make scratches. If we double click on the actual generator, we can come in here and we can adjust its properties. Now you can set these up any way you want, but I had kind of already took a look at these, and I'm just going to go ahead and set them up the way I had them in my test. And we can take a look at what this looks like, and that gives us, you know, some nice scratches. They're kind of big, so I'm also going to get a transform 2D, and I'm going to make them smaller. And we can take it down to 25%. So I just hit by half twice, and that's 50% of 50%, which gives us the right size, but now they're all kind of washed out and grayed out. So I'm going to want to get their levels back up. And we can bring this in there like that and correct our levels. So they just become more visible because we're going to use this as one of our masks. I'm also going to bring my parent size up because I want to see what it looks like at a higher res. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring this node down to a lower res. I'm not liking its performance here, and I don't really need it at a high res. So I'm going to bring it 1 down from parent size. But what that's done is now my whole chain has been affected by this. So this transform node, instead of having it be relative to input as far as all its size information goes, I'm going to have it be relative to parent. So it will now start getting its output size information from the parent. And that's going to bring that back up to 2K. So I've reduced the amount of processing time it's taken here, and I've just increased the physical size of the image here because I don't really need these scratches at a super high resolution, so I can actually do that. But this is, it's only 1K worth of information in this 2K map, but what it's going to do is it's going to give me the correct kind of relationships with all the nodes down the road. And this is the beginnings of our scratches segment. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a frame around this, and we'll call it scratches because things are going to get busy. And the other thing I just know I'm going to need, because I've already done this, is I'm going to want an inverse of this, because this is going to be our, our mask for the scratches, but sometimes I'm going to want the inverse of that mask. I'm going to go into the library. I'm going to start typing invert, and I'm going to get my invert grayscale. And all this does is it inverts this image. So I now have my scratches complete with my 2 scratches masks. The next segment we're going to build is going to take care of the kind of the gritty roughness of the ice around the scratches, because in the areas where the ice is scratched, it's not scratches on top of purely shiny ice. It's been messed up in a way. So it's going to be the least shiny area of our ice, and I would like the roughness and the normals and everything to reflect that. So I want like a really, really fine noise, and I'm going to just use a white noise for that. But a white noise is very even, and I'm also going to get clouds too. Again, all of these things that I'm using, you can feel free to insert your own images here. This is just one way of doing it. And what I want to do is I want to take this white noise and I want to make it less even by breaking it up using the clouds 2 as a mask. So I want to see the result of this here. And I put this levels node in here so that we can mess around with this some and see what we want as far as our effect goes for the gritty bits. So they'll kind of fade in and out, and we might have a couple of areas where it's perfectly shiny, but for the most part, we kind of want grit everywhere. We can always change this out later, but I think for now, that's fine. And this becomes our grit. So we'll add a frame, and we'll call it grit. And finally, we'll create our crackles. So the parts of the ice that are kind of crackly, and we'll use crystal 1 for this one. And I'm looking at my notes here. I have the scale set to 32, which is what it is now. So that's fine. And all we really need for this one is a levels node. So we'll be able to adjust how these appear. And let's make a frame around this one and call it crackles. So we've now got these three elements that we're going to use to create our glass. And the way we're going to set them up is going to allow us to adjust the way each and every one of these elements interacts with the others. Before we actually start hooking things up, I want to build one more mask, and that's going to deal with the two different kinds of areas that we are going to have here. Grit and scratches are going to appear in one of them, and then crackles is going to appear in the other. And we're going to base this map off of this clouds 2 that we already have. So I'm just going to grab this transform 2D. I'm going to get into the node itself, and I'm going to multiply it by 2. And this is giving me a bigger version of the same clouds, but it's going to be different because it's going to cover completely different spots. So I'm using one node for two things here. Then I'm going to bring down a levels node because I actually do want it more mask-like. I want to turn these clouds into two distinct regions, that have some gradation between them, but it's basically two things I want here. So we'll start fooling around with our levels, and we'll get it to a point where we like the mask that we're creating that's going to have our two different kinds of ice in there. So that's pretty good right there. And the next thing I'm going to get is a bevel node. A bevel node, I love bevel nodes. Bevel nodes take a grayscale image and they bevel it. And you will notice that they give you a height and a normal map. So you get these two corresponding maps that give you both height and normals for this bevel that you can create, and you can change the size of your bevel, and you can even, if you want, you can have it going in the negative direction. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and I think that looks pretty nice right there. Again, we can always switch it out later. In fact, I think let's do this a different way. I'm going to bring this higher up here, and let's get a levels node to create a wider area in here as a mask. I want to, the reason I'm doing this is I'm looking at the normal here. I actually kind of want two different things to happen with my grayscale map, which I'm not actually going to be using as a height map. I'm going to be using it as a mask. So I don't want my grayscale mask to have that gradient in it, but I do want that gradient in my normal. So if I come in here and change the levels, I'm creating two different masks out of this gray. I mean, I have a normal, and then I now have a matching mask as opposed to a matching height map. And again, simply because I know we're going to need one, this mask, we're just going to get an inverse of this as well. And now we have this trio where we have the bevel, which is going to give us this normal that we're going to need. Then we're creating a mask out of that beveled area, which is going to separate the different noises that we have back here, and then we just get an inverse of that map. So this, let's just make a frame around those. We can call this area masks. These are the basic elements that we're now just going to hook up and then hook into our output nodes. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is get our grit and scratches blended correctly for each one of the various outputs that we're going to need to create. We'll start with the roughness, and we're going to use exactly the same procedure for each one of these. So, it's a lot of nodes, but it's also a lot of repetition. So first, let's start with hooking up each one of these to its own levels node, and then we can put the levels nodes into a blend, and in this case for the roughness we're going to use a lighten, and we can see the result here. And now we can adjust the results to get the effect we want using each individual levels node. Now in this case, we're talking about the roughness. So right now what we want to do is we want to correct the roughnesses here for their relationship to each other. So I'm looking at just my gritty areas as a whole, and I want to know what is the relationship between my scratches and my sort of noisy grit here, regardless of how the whole material is moving up and down in the scale from completely smooth to completely rough. Right now, I'm only looking at the relationships between these two. And I need to see these guys, I want to see them a whole lot rougher and more distinct. So I'm going to bring up the whiteness on these. And this, I want to see a whole lot rougher. Because remember, this is the gritty bits. This is the part that is going to be the least shiny of the ice. So I want it smoother, but then I think I want the whole thing a little bit lighter as well. So I'm getting the scratches are coming in completely white. And then the areas around the scratches are a little bit shinier than the scratches themselves, but they're not completely smooth either. And we are going to run the normals map off these same two as well. So I'm happy with this relationship the way it is now. And then once I'm happy with the relationship, I'm going to get another levels node. And I'm not going to do anything with it for now. But this is the levels node I'm going to use when I start blending the two different areas together using the area mask. So this is our roughness. And again, I'm going to make a frame and we'll call it roughness. And in fact, we can probably copy this whole thing and paste it and save some time making our specular, which is the one we're going to do, which is the one we're going to do next. So I can highlight my frame and change the name. And now let's think about what we need to see happening with our specular information. Now if I look at my scratches and I think about what do I want the most reflective part here. And the most reflective part here is not going to be the interior of the scratches. It's going to be the area outside of the scratches. So I really don't want to be using this version. I really want to be using this version because by default, it's closer to what I need. I want the insides of my scratches not to have any reflection at all. And then the outside, if it's going to have reflection, it's going to be on the outside of the scratches, not on the inside. And if we take a look at our grit, yeah, that we can leave alone. It's okay the way it is. I mean, technically, we should probably make an inverse for this map, but honestly, it's probably not worth the effort. And we can look at these blended, but now we've got a lighten blend in here, and we would be better served in this case, I think, with a darken blend, because we're looking for the darkest of all the colors to shine through. And the darkest are the ones that are not going to have any specularity at all. And what that means is all I have left now is this map to get it to be specular the way I want it. Now again, we're talking about the rough areas of the map. So the proportions are fine because we set those up. But I want to see a whole lot less specularity overall. Because these aren't the shiny bits of the ice. These are going to be the dullest bits of the ice. So it should have some, because it's ice still, but it should be a pretty low value here. And this levels, again, we're not touching that. Right, let's move this out of the way a little bit more. And we can continue onwards. Now, the specular and the normal are pretty much related because they're going to kind of use the same, exactly the same masks because they're talking about the same directions as far as grayscale goes. So again, I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it. Only this time, instead of having this levels node here, we're just going to turn it into a normal. And let's take a closer look at our noise here. I'd like to see more accentuation on my little scratches there if possible. So let's see whether we can't get those to be a little bit more black. That's probably better. Yeah, we can see those a bit better, and we've got that nice noise around it. So this is going to work as the normals for that area. And finally, we need to take care of, actually we've got two more things. We've got our color and we've got our opacity. Let's take care of our opacity first. So let's copy this one. I'm copying because of the blend that we're going to use. This way we don't have to switch out the blend because we're going to want a lighten blend again. So we'll paste it up here. And we will call this opacity. And now we will correct for our opacity. And again, we're doing, this is going to be the darkest, the most opaque it's going to be. So I really want to see more opacity. And I'm going to make this much lighter. So at its most opaque, it will be like this. And then as we lower it, the whole thing will go down. And these guys aren't going to get, again, because here we're using a light node, so this black is going to get erased immediately, and these lines aren't really getting any more white than they already are. So here we have, this looks pretty good. We've got almost completely opaque with those lines that are completely opaque. And finally, the color, and we can, again, I think taking this roughness map, copying it, and making another one up in here is going to be the easiest of all because it's, again, it's got good color in here, and instead of having a levels here, we're going to get a gradient map, and we're going to create some colors for ourselves. So I've clicked on my gradient map, and I'm going to my gradient editor, and I'm going to keep this very, very simple. I'm going to pick two colors, well, one color in white. If you want to get more complicated with your color, that's great. But I'm picking just this very light blue. And you can, if you look very carefully, you can see that I am getting some color variation. And unless you want colored ice, I really don't recommend getting too dark with your colors. But you shouldn't, but white is kind of boring. So it's nice to have a little bit of color in there. And we'll rename this color. So now we have actually put together, let's change that. We've put together these two, the grit and the scratches. So this here represents our rough areas. And we're now going to work on the smoother areas, which is going to be the crackles, and that's all by itself. So there's really nothing to mix. And here we're going to do exactly the same thing, only we're just going to do levels nodes and we're not going to mix them. So for our roughness, we actually want the opposite of this, because if you think about it, these high areas, if we're going to be using this for our normal map, we're going to want those, if anything, those are going to be the shiniest ones. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get an invert grayscale, and I will make an inversion for that, and then I'm going to put it into my levels node. And now I can adjust my roughness, which I want this to be pretty smooth, so we will go ahead and just make it a whole lot darker. And so only those edges within, you know, like the deepest cracks are going to have some roughness on them. The rest of it we're just going to get much smoother. So that's good for a start. Again, you know, all of these we're going to be able to come back and deal with them. Again, we're thinking about the roughest, so that's probably the roughest right there. And we can make a frame around this and call this roughness. And the next thing we did was specular. So the specular, again, the deepest areas are going to be the least specular. So we're going to use not the inverse, but the positive. We should actually move this up in here. We're going to use the positive end of it. So we can get another levels node, pull this in here, and I want this actually very specular because these are going to be the shiny bits of my glass. Not glass, of my ice, sorry. And that'll probably do for now. And I'm going to make a frame. You could make a comment too, or you don't have to do anything at all. It's just when things get really big like this, sometimes it's easier to use a frame because you can see it from a bigger distance. Like I can pull all the way out here and I can really see what's going on. And that's why I'm bothering to make frames out of all of these, because it's taking up a lot of room, this material. It's not complicated, it's just sprawling. Normal. So we'll pull out a normal node and we can hook that up and we'll fill alpha with input. And let's give it a bit more. And we'll make a frame for this, call it normal. And then we have color and opacity. So the color, I'm actually going to copy this gradient map right there because I want the exact same colors. I'm going to paste it up in here. And we will keep the positive for that. And that looks pretty good. And finally, we'll do our opacity. So we'll get another levels. And I want to have my opacity, we're going to have, if anything's going to be transparent, it's going to be the cracks themselves, not the little high peaks. So we will be using this mask. And we are correcting for the most opaque. So we'll take the whole thing up. But I think I also want this to be more even as well. I don't want there to be a, you know, within the material, within that texture itself, I don't want there to be a lot of black. So let's call this the most opaque and give it a frame. So those are our little sections organized. And now all we have to do is hook them up together using these area masks we created. And we'll do that in part 2.